Good afternoon. I am your moderator this afternoon. Gabby is coming from a meeting and has caught a nasty cold as well. We're very lucky to have Igor Grossmann here with us today, and actually to have him here with us this whole month visiting knowledge governance transformations. Some of you joined us on the 6th when we had Igor giving us a great talk on wisdom and what that means for how we're building artificial intelligence and what wisdom even means in practice as a human quality. We're staying in that thread of talking about cognition. This is Igor's bread and butter. He's a professor of psychology at the University of Waterloo, and is the director of the Wisdom and Culture Lab, where they're working a lot on wise decisions and what does this mean for how we, humans, machines, and humans and machines together make decisions. Those of you who joined us for the David Tuckett cluster last year might recognize some common themes in terms of the relationship between emotions and what we call rationality in decision making and the complexity of decision making. And that's really a lovely thread in terms of what Igor and his team work on. There's a nice mix of social and cultural psychology, but also these hard computational methods of working with AI. How does our landscape of values come into that? So you can tell why we're excited to have him with the array of interdisciplinary topics that they're working on. We very much like the work on taking this concept of decision making and wise judgment beyond Western centric concepts of decision making, and that's really in the terms that are used on the lab. The idea that decision making is not just some neutral, uniform, and harmonized process, but that there are deep human and cultural and social aspects that come into these processes. I very much encourage everyone to go look at the website of the Wisdom and Culture Lab. They've got this great page called a lab philosophy. And I think that the philosophy that the lab sets out is really what you're going to see echoed in this presentation, the idea of intellectual humility and echoing the approach and the questions that we're going to be discussing today. If you have time, check out their podcast. It's been going for a solid 8 years, I think, as of last month, which is very impressive. I think they're at 60 something episodes. And then the last topic that they're really working on that you're going to see us touching upon today as well is with their forecasting collective. So what does forecasting look like across different cultures? How do we bring in uncertainty, evidence? And how does that relate to processes of reasoning, which is everything that Igor is going to talk us through today with their 3-year project that he's presenting. So plenty of questions, plenty of things to connect to, I'm assuming, in your work and definitely in ours. As always, feel very open to ask questions and join the discussion after his presentation. If there are any technical issues at any point, drop a message in the chat or put up your hand. And we look forward to hearing from you. Over to you, Igor.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I hope those of you who are joining us now or who may be watching this later will find some of this useful. I will try to go through some of the studies that my colleagues and I have done over the course actually of the last, I guess, 6 years. Since that time, I've been to Florence before. Many things have changed, and I will try to do a little bit of a sort of retrospective on that, as well as talk about this new project. So, if it's too much, well, rewind and watch it again. But I hope it will be mostly accessible. And yeah, as Mira already pointed out, if there are any questions or if something is unclear, please don't hesitate and either put it in the chat and Mira will then communicate it to me because I can't see the chat right now, or we can discuss them at the end. Okay, so the way it started is just basically when we think about this situation around the world, we have a lot of information. It's doubling, faster than we can think. By the time this talk is over, there's twice as much info in the world as there was before. Kind of humbling to think that way. There are natural disasters. We have geopolitical tensions. We have climate crisis right now, for instance, in Africa and many other parts in the world. Wars raging in Ukraine and in the Middle East. And it seems like sort of like the culture that we know and the systems that we have set up is changing in front of our eyes. and there's some kind of an idea that the new world order may be emerging or something like that, and we try to figure out what's happening next. And in that moment, there's this kind of interest that I find interest in understanding what is the culture, understanding what is the human behavior, and of course, somebody who studies both culture and human behavior, I find it very exciting, as it is threatening to me personally to think about those changes, because I think, wow, gee, we have all these causal models that's supposed to be explaining behavior and societal processes. Maybe we can use those to help policymakers to foster positive societal change. I mean, ultimately, that's what science is partially about, especially text-based science. I mean, I work at a public university, which means that, I receive money from the Canadian government to help figure out what's happening next. I mean, of course, I do basic research, but there is obviously an idea that at some point we'll be able to contribute towards the common good and policy potentially. At least that's the idea. And of course, we have like a lot of interesting theories in my field, for instance, but I'm sure in your fields as well. They range from macro to micro. Many theories about cultural dynamics and evolution, a bit about beliefs, a bit about ecological changes and how those ecological changes may promote changes in our behavior, be it collective or individual, or various shifts in sociopolitical systems and how they again would have consequences for our behavior. And what's interesting is that most of them are cross-sectional, cross-cultural, often be it in political science or in psychology. Some of them focus on change, not that many. But really, like I've been thinking about this for more than a decade. In fact, probably since graduate school, when I became a psychologist, I became a psychologist to study how cultures differ and why they differ. And the question why cultures differ in their psychological makeup and behavior of individuals is ultimately linked to the question of the possible theories and causal models, in other words, that would promote those changes. And so I've been thinking about this and thinking about this, and then this happened when we were all in lockdowns here in Italy, of course, quite dramatic. So, in my hometown, I mean, and then in Toronto, where I lived over the pandemic, we had several lockdowns. And when you think about that time, so you lie in bed, it's sort of March 2020, you can sleep, and then sort of you're maybe a social scientist, you start thinking about how the world may be changing. And then you're waking up, and so you can see that you're not the only one, because by next morning you already have a flurry of papers that are writing about this, be it among the pundits, in various newspapers or think tanks, or even in reputable academic outlets, be it in Proceedings of National Academy or in the Nature outlet, where there were a number of pieces that came out within a month of the pandemic, at least in North America and Western Europe, which have reports, some quite visible, about the advising about the societal changes ahead. And I found this kind of interesting because I thought, well, okay, interesting. So, do we do that quite often? Do we make those predictions? And much, how systematic is that? Are these, for instance, just outliers? And then how accurate are those? So that's where I started when I started looking at it, because I had this sense, in part, that we don't do it very often. We often don't really study change. We'll study just cross-country differences or regional differences, and they don't really scale up to actual dynamic processes and changes, a completely different level of analysis. Um, and so the question is, would they scale up? And then also, like, who would be making those predictions? So, by the way, so this point that I'm trying to make right now about people right at the beginning of the pandemic making predictions, if you think that this is an exception and you're trying to apply no true Scotsman argument, that is like a real scientist would never ever make predictions. Well, we actually looked at that in a piece that we then published in American Psychologist in 23, because I heard this argument from several people. So we did some historical analysis. There was this coronavirus corpus from the English language corpus on the web, where we can look at a representative sample of all news reports in the English language around the world. And we can look at the snippet between, let's say, March 15th of 2020 and May 15th of 2020, the first couple of months of the pandemic. And then you can see how often people are inviting experts, how often experts then talk about the pandemic, how often do they refer to their expertise and talk about the domains in which they actually are experts versus not. And also, very importantly, these are sort of newspaper reports in which scientists would be consulted. And are they just making observations about what's happening during that period, or are they actually making a prediction? So every third was actually making a prediction. And they did not only do it because they were consulted, some of them actually explicitly wrote op-eds saying, I know what the future will hold. Let me tell you, this is the key thing. And how did they do it? Well, as you can see in this graph on the bottom in the justification, most of them had no justification whatsoever. Uh, the others were just referring to the present, restating the facts. And very few actually had some kind of reference to research or some other type of models. We, by the way, cross-validated. This were about 200 behavioral scientists, mostly was focusing on psychology and some other social sciences. Cross-validated all credentials, coded all of them for those domains. And as I said, yeah, the evidence of people making predictions during the pandemic was quite striking, and most of those predictions were not justified predictions. Um, okay, but the question, of course, is like, are these predictions accurate? I mean, ultimately, the idea is like, why do you ask scientists to make some kind of statements about uncertain periods? Because you think that the academic credentials give them some form of expertise that we can rely on to really figure out what's going to happen, how we can prepare ourselves for the future. And when I was sleeping or not really sleeping in that night at the beginning of the pandemic in Toronto, I was thinking about this quite extensively. And one thing I thought I was like, would be nice to collect those estimations about what the field or scientists writ large think about where the future is heading, and then evaluate potentially the accuracy. So I've done that in various ways. And one way we did it was very cheaply. This is basic like a set of surveys with the largest study of scientists today, at least in North America. But we also had people from other parts of the world. As you can see, there's some from Europe, but heavily North American focus, given that I am based in North America, and most of them from psychology. We were interested in social behavioral processes. And the people who responded were tenured faculty or postdocs, some grad students, but most of them had credentials. And what I asked them to do is I asked them like, look, so there's this multiple domains where we thought social scientists would have something to say because there are theories about if this happens, then this will occur. So, for instance, there are theories about pathogen stress effects on intergroup processes, environmental threat effects on reproduction and present focus, whether you want to have babies or not, stuff like that. Or a whole range of theories about stress, social isolation, and mental health. And for instance, like one classic example is like consider political affective polarization in the United States, defined as the degree of dislike and distrust towards those from the opposing political party. Where do you think it will head in the next uh, half a year, the next year, the next 2 years? So we've done that. Like it's exactly the questions that we asked, like in this example. And then at the beginning, I was really just interested in a whole range of domains. So like I had like over 15 domains. And then fortunately, I was very lucky because some of them we actually got national level estimates. And I collaborated with a large number of national and international organizations that provided them the data for us. And so for 10 domains, we were able to go back and compare what did people say in the surveys versus what the actual ground truth markers in those domains are. And yeah, so we were able to focus on societal change. I mean, here many of them are cross-sectional, of course, but these are national level probability samples, or we use population estimates with some ranking to weighting, so to adjust for the population. And we try to cross-validate it with multiple indicators. And what I will present to you is just like some simple results from this silly survey. We've done it multiple times, by the way. It's not just not just at the beginning of the pandemic in May and June of 2020. I did it half a year later in the fall, right before the US election. The focus is always in the US because that's where the most markers, unfortunately, are coming from. I wish I could have done it in Europe or in Asia or in Africa, but unfortunately, the ugly truth is for many of the domains, at least until Trump, we had many more markers and indicators in the United States and reliability that those will be collected in the future. Now, that may change, of course. Anyways, so simple thing. Did you get the direction right where the trend is heading on those various domains? And so, by the way, I did it for scientists, and just for fun, I decided to get a region stratified sample from Prolific. So these are not experts who these are just like lay people who would be making predictions in a very similar format as the scientists did at the same time period. Okay. And we want to just know, did they get the direction right? And also, what did they predict in the first place? And so, what I will show you is the estimates on average of the psychological scientists, and some of them are not just psychology, also economics, political science. Then I will show you lay people, and I will show you the ground truth marker. It will be a gray bar. So what you see here on the bottom is like, okay, so we have orange psychological scientists, we have lay people, and we have a ground truth marker. And what you see on the top is like they just were indicating percentage change vis-a-vis May of 2020, the direction, like whether it will go higher, so depression rates, for instance, or degree of individualism. We had like markers for all those, or loneliness, or if it will go lower compared to April, May of 2020. Okay. And on the bottom, I just look at the percentage correct. Did they get the direction right? Okay. I really just look at the direction. I don't even look at the magnitude because that's really hard to predict, of course. But did they get the direction right? And so two things stand out. Number one, um, it's kind of a toss. You see those pluses and minuses? If you count them up, you'll see that people on average are not better than chance, if you were to sum it up. Number two, lay people and psychological scientists were kind of equivalent. I mean, there's like literally no difference on average between the expertise of those who supposedly have this grand theories, causal models, and those who have no idea and just base it on their intuitions. So that was just one interesting example. We did, by the way, also retrospectives, like, so, maybe forecasting the future is difficult, but like looking back half a year, what happened in the last half a year in the last year will differ. And the answer is no, it was exactly the same pattern. So, but it's all intuitive. And of course, scientists don't work like that. Scientists typically, have data, they examine the data, they work in groups, they quiz each other, they challenge each other, and so on and so forth. So, right at the beginning, I also decided like this is interesting because we can then maybe use this as an opportunity, to organize a large scale, largest in the world until that moment, tournament of scientists in terms of their predicting power for the social dynamics over the course of the pandemic. And I took this challenge and I formed the forecasting collaborative where then we issued a call and ended up with 120 teams from around the world. Again, so the predictions were locked in for the United States because that's where we had most data. And here it became even more challenging because I wanted to give people data for the last several years, month level data. So like for every single month, because I wanted them to make predictions for the next 12 months and in the domains of their choice. But these are like all people who agreed to participate. There were also incentives. We announced the winners. They put it on their CVs, all that jazz. The majority came from psychology, but of course, many from computer science and economics, where this type of forecasting or Kaggle type of competitions are common. And so what we did, like there were two actually, because there was initial one, and then I gave people the opportunity to update their predictions, giving them information how much they deviated from ground truth in the first half a year. So we did it almost like in real time. And because I wanted to have this very accurate data, we had to be even more stringent in terms of the number of benchmarks that are available about this sort of social issue. So I actually ended up only with a few that were fairly reliable on a monthly level, on a monthly basis, and those involve like affective sentiment or life satisfaction. Usually, I have a little side story about that. Tell you in a second. Political orientation and political polarization, and then there's a database of scholars. This is actually not representative samples, but they're very large, and we can weight them based on census representation on various forms of outgroup prejudice. And so we gave for these markers up to 39 months of data, and they could use it to model the responses. And then we compared various types of expertise here. Like we looked at performance against naive benchmarks, like a random walk, or historical mean, or linear regression from the past data, or relative performance to non-scientists. So like I had a group of non-experts, non-SMEs do exactly the same thing as scientists, simulating the same platform. There was an actual platform. They had to upload their Excel sheets, which would also show them what that trend is like compared to the previous trend, if those are the data points that they predict. So they cross-check, they upload it. I mean, they justify their choices. They were asked to provide rationales for their choices. And then we also looked at domain-specific evidence, like, for instance, did they have publications on this topic? Do they actually study depression or loneliness or prejudice? How confident are they in their team's performance and expertise? Like, my team has strong expertise on this particular topic. And so let me give you a little bit about the benchmark. So this is a funny story, talking about predictions. So normally, those of you who study anything related to well-being may know that Gallup has been collecting the large-scale surveys. World Happiness Reports in the United States have been doing the surveys on a monthly basis for decades. Except that they stopped in 2019. End of 2019, they ran out of money. Nobody would be funding them. So it's like, okay, that's it. A really interesting moment to stop. But because of that, we couldn't use them. Of course, they restarted in March of 2020 because the U.S. government suddenly gave them money again. Um, but because of that, we couldn't use it. So I actually had to rely on Twitter data at that time because that one was continuously available, and there were some interesting developments with approximations of the general sentiment in the population using the social media data. So we used those and collaborated with people who developed those estimates for effective well-being and life satisfaction. Now, for politics, this is as good as it gets. You get the weighted data from congressional generic ballot in the United States, or presidential approval ratings from Gallup. That stuff Gallup still kept collecting. And then for the explicit and implicit prejudice, we looked at the data from Project Implicit, which collects both explicit endorsement of like positive and negative of outgroup members, be it African Americans versus white Americans, or Asian Americans versus white Americans. Um, or implicit prejudice, which is a different way to get at it. So, like basically, if you form associations almost spontaneously between black and bad and white and good, or stuff like that. I mean, there are questions about that metric and what it means. I will not go into that, but we just used it because that data has been available and we can evaluate it. Now, the key thing here, and I'll just go through this very quickly, how do you assess forecasting accuracy when the metrics are on completely different scales? Well, that's a good question. It's very challenging. There are debates about that in the field. The state of the art is probably the so-called mean absolute squared error, scaled error. Usually, if the mean is on the same scale, you just look at the difference between the error and observed value. So you have a forecast, and then you look at the observed value, and you look at the difference score, right, like the delta, and then you can average those across the 12 month, for instance. But if it's on different scales, the ingenious solution is to scale it by dividing it by the error of the simple forecast, that is the random walk. So you take the simple naive forecast as the denominator and mean absolute error in your upper part. And what that does is it's very neat because if you look at this simple equation, you see that then scores that are above one are then becoming worse than the simple forecast, and scores that are below one are better than the simple forecast. So you actually want scores that are below one. Keep in mind, this is in-sample random walk, which is often hard to beat because you're doing out-of-sample prediction compared to in-sample control. It's kind of hard, a little bit of cheating. But nevertheless, that's a way to standardize it. So we want scores that are below one. So let's have a look at the results. We did it twice. As a reminder, we have scientists, we have the naive crowd, general public from prolific, and we have this kind of average of the or sort of the best of the naive statistics, just like out of sample random walk or linear regression or just average of the historical data points that I gave people. Here are the results. So you see the first tournament on the top, you see the second tournament on the bottom. Two things stand out. Number one, yes, naive crowd, by the way, is only in the first tournament. We didn't do it the second time because we couldn't get the same people back because naive crowds are anonymous. I couldn't really contact them again, but scientists I could. So two things stand out. Number one, scientists get better over time. So the first tournaments, they perform significantly worse than the second one. Number two, um, well, they still kind of suck, to put it plainly, because look, they're supposed to be on to the left of the dotted, this kind of red line, and they're not, or dashed red line, vertical line, and they're not. They're, in fact, for most domains, they perform worse than the random walk, than this baseline, right? Below one. They are not below one, they're above one. Um, you also see that the naive statistics in most cases beat scientists or are on par with scientists. And many domains are much better than scientists. So, like that is taking a historical mean is in many domains better than getting the average, than the wisdom of crowds from the experts, or at least those who claim to have expertise. Now, that's a bit of a sombering message. What are the factors that contributed to accuracy? So here I'll show you a range of factors that we qualified in this tournament, and the denominator, the dependent variable here, the criterion is the accuracy. So not Mace, Mace is inaccuracy. We flipped it. So now it's higher score means more accurate. And what contributes towards accuracy? Let's have a look. Well, are the teams that are more multidisciplinary performing better? Maybe, but the evidence is very weak, in fact, non-significant. Having behavioral scientists on the team, not so much. So the only two things that really mattered are, on the one hand, if you had experience with tournaments or you had actually domain-specific expertise, you had a little bit of an advantage. It was not a huge advantage. It was a bit of an advantage. These are unstandardized coefficients from a regression. On the other hand, if your model was too complicated, because some people propose sophisticated models, they overfit the data. So the more parameters in the model, the worse their accuracy. The more complex the model, the worse the accuracy. The rest didn't really matter that much. Confidence and forecasts of the team didn't really matter, and expertise didn't really matter. Number of PhDs on the team didn't really matter. Number of predicted domains that they engaged in also didn't matter. So what does that mean? This first part, scientists were not better than lay people, not better than linear regression, even the random walk. In other words, the causal models in various aspects of psychology or social behavioral sciences were not really effective at predicting societal change. And that's sort of what I did in the first couple of years of the pandemic. And what's interesting about this is that that's not what the public expects scientists to be like. So we did the study. This was also in 2021, in March of 2021, we asked a large group of people, well, large, 200 something US residents, to tell me who do they think they would want to have at the table making predictions or helping the policymakers evaluate how to navigate the pandemic. And no, people thought that public health specialists, social workers, and psychology. It would be those three domains that they would be expecting. Epidemiology, maybe. And uh, the fun fact, politicians were on the very bottom. In fact, you would rather pick a random person from the street, a random person from the street, rather than a politician. This is tells you a little bit much about how much we trusted politicians during the pandemic. I'm not sure if that increased. Political science is just a nudge above average Americans. So this was a study done on Americans, of course, and economics. So those two were actually not trusted much. They would rather trust historian of person in medicine. So now let me summarize this first part. Um, I started by saying that, we have all these societal trends that involve risks and they need some kind of way to anticipate those risks. But our expertise is kind of lacking. I showed it to you with the evidence that we gathered over the course of the pandemic. But it's not the first time this claim has been made, of course, be it with the financial crisis in 2008 with the recession, or the evidence that expert forecasts rarely outperform simple statistical baselines. And why it matters is because public trusts scientific expertise. Now, I made the point in the Trends in Cognitive Science piece saying that, okay, of course, on the one hand, we don't have relevant data because some political actors don't want us to have access to it, or there's like funding issues. And then there's obviously, on the other hand, on the top of the mountain, towards the peak of accurate predictions, you have the inherent stochasticities or variability and unpredictability of certain phenomena. There's also noise, but in the middle there is this set of slips in scientific reasoning that either as an expert or as a layperson you often succumbing to. Those involve a mismatched level of analysis, of reliance on various forms of rudimentary or reductionist approaches, or tunnel vision, where each scientist thinks that whatever they're studying is the thing to study and everything else is irrelevant. So it's a kind of like very isolationist, not complex systems approach to our fields. It's not a new point. Here's Burton, one of arguably great sociologists of the 20th century, who said that ignorance, error, and imperious immediacy of interest are among the factors that block effective social planning. Or if you like physics, here's Richard Feynman, who said, I have approximate answers and possible beliefs and different degrees of certainty about different things, but I'm not absolutely sure of anything. So, all right, if it's not domain expertise, what determines forecasting skill? Well, it turns out that cognitive ability by itself, how smart you are, is not enough. It's actually maybe associated with less probabilistic error, but at the same time, you can still be susceptible to motivated reasoning, where you would convince yourself of anything you want to convince yourself on. And the smarter you are, the more likely you are to convince yourself of those things because you can generate more reasons why you're correct. And you're also at least susceptible to anchoring and overconfidence in your judgment. There's enough evidence about that. So we thought, okay, well, maybe actually maybe it's not just cognitive abilities alone. And what we really need is if you want to be effective in your foresight, be it in forecasting or scenario planning, so things that Gabi is very interested in here, then you need to be flexible. You need to recognize when beliefs need updating. You need to weigh conflicting evidence without defensiveness. And you need to calibrate your confidence to limits of your knowledge. And there are certain elements of those, and these forms of metacognitive sensitivity, flexibility, and epistemic calibration are fundamental elements of what philosophers for a long time described as intellectual humility. And essentially, one can posit that this is sort of a metacognitive foundation for iterative learning that forecasting demands. So it's like the success would require updating your beliefs as new data arrives, integrating different pieces of information, maintaining appropriate certainty and uncertainty about volatile phenomena. So I thought about testing this. And so in the next 15 minutes or so, I want to show you some evidence about how we decided to test this on the largest study, 3-year long experiment that tried to look at it, both among the experts, but really mostly among the lay people, because experts are hard to find large enough samples. And this is an empirical project. It's, by the way, done with my student Peter and my postdoc Maxime and a person who helped project manager Corey, who's a professor now at a new college, I think, in Florida, and my dear friend and colleague Phil Tetlock, who's done quite a bit on forecasting. So the questions are, does intellectual humility predict forecasting accuracy beyond cognitive ability or interacting with cognitive abilities? Does high intellectual humility predict greater improvement over time? And how does domain volatility and exposure to different predictions may moderate these effects? So it's very ambitious, maybe too ambitious. But here's what we did. We thought like, okay, let's really look at the domains that are most indicative of global welfare or changes in global welfare. And for that, we'll contact subject matter experts who would identify domains and indicators of societal progress. Because who am I to say what the key markers of societal progress are? I have no idea. I may be very biased just based on my own research. So let me ask others who would be nominated by their fields. And then we would do a tournament with the public, a large group of people who was selected based on their attentiveness, they really mean it, and see how they do and who did better. Okay, so we asked the subject matter experts to select various domains. And I was, first of all, my first shock, and maybe I shouldn't be shocked by now, but my first shock was that of all the domains that you can think of, or the experts could think of, we used do an audit of those domains in terms of the data quality and the benchmarks that are available. Only 3 or so would meet the basic criteria of generalizability. It's sort of representing more than just like 1/5 of the world, timely resolution, and transparency. In fact, even things like economy, we were forced to focus just on poverty rate in the United States because it's not guaranteed that you will be able to get evidence of economic progress in most countries in a timely fashion, specifically poverty rates. We were interested not in GDP, but poverty rates. But for these domains, we were able to focus on CO2 emissions, pretty easy to get, global infant mortality, also reliably assessed. And then there's an institute in Scandinavia that assesses prevalence of global non-state conflicts. I've been doing that at least since the beginning of the 90s, and so we included those. So those are the 4 domains. And then our participants in the study were pre-selected. We lured them from a large group that we cultivated after excluding those who did not pass attention and bought checks. And yeah, about half of them ended up participating in the first study. We paid them quite well, $50 per study, and then there was incentives, economic incentives for doing well in the study. And they were well distributed. As you can see, more than half of them agreed to stay on until the very end. And by the way, differences between those who stayed on and did not stay on did not pan out to be meaningful. The only difference is that those who stayed on until the very end of the project were a little bit older, but that did not contribute towards accuracy. And we also included if they stayed on or not in the subsequent analysis. So as you can see, like kind of equally distributed by gender, good age range, and diversity in terms of education, income, and even ideology. So it's not just that we had like highly liberal people, which is often a problem in this type of social behavioral studies. Okay, the reason why I said it may have been too much is because this is the setup of the study. Okay, so we have a large number, and I'll go through this in a second, one by one. There's a large number of measures that we collected at the beginning. They're cognitive, there are certain dispositions about their sort of personality attitudes or attitudes towards the world, if they're positive, negative, and a bunch of measures of intellectual humility across different levels of analysis. And then we had the actual study set up, as you can see here in this loop. We basically gave them 30 years of data Okay, we gave them real data, like month by month with each of those four domains. Then I made the initial prediction, and then I was interested in how will they perform if they see a wide variety of predictions from others in the group that they were assigned to, or very similar predictions from others in the group. So there's like random assignment to one of these two conditions. Then they were able to update their predictions, and then we also looked at the rationales as well as self-report measures where they were confident or not super confident in their predictions, how willing they would be to revise their beliefs and so on. So those are markers of intellectual humility. I'll get to that in a second. Then we did the same thing in the second year with actual performance feedback. And then in the third year. And so essentially, as you can see there on the bottom, we started 22, then we have the first year predictions, and then we have feedback and forecast, and we have the second year prediction and the third year prediction with feedback. So like they iterate and can benefit from feedback. Now, two things, or one thing, it just happened, and I'll explain it to you in a second again, that some domains were more volatile than others just because of the historical benchmarks turned out to be more volatile. I didn't plan it like that, but you will see like the CO2 concentration and infant mortality are much more monotonous compared to the other two. So now let me unpack it. So this is where we started. And then for each domain, people make a prediction and provide the rationale. So they make both next year prediction, which I will focus to for ground truth analysis and far out prediction. Then they do teams predictions and they have opportunity to update. So to give you a concrete example, so here's, for instance, the actual screenshot from what they see on this website interface that we custom developed. What will the global occurrence of non-state conflict be in 2023? And then we provide the data, and then we also provide the explanation what we mean by that. And they have to provide the next few data points in numbers as well as on a graph, so dynamic interactive graph, and provide the rationale. Okay, so we have forecasts for the next years and rationales. Then they read the fake team's feedback. This was randomly assigned that teams are either very similar to each other in terms of forecasts and rationales or very different. And they can update based on that information. And so this is what it looks like dynamically. So this is the in the second year, for instance, we also give them actual feedback. This is the actual outcome in red. And then your prediction is in blue. They also provide the bands around it. It's like highest reasonable estimate and lowest reasonable estimate that they think is still possible to get a degree of uncertainty, how calibrated they are, essentially. Not just their best guess, but also how calibrated they are. Okay, and so essentially we have this markers before the study, then we have this manipulation, and we have rationales that are then coded for actually open-ended responses, coded for presence of acknowledging limits of knowledge, welcoming different perspectives, or how confident they are, and then we create sort of a composite score based on that, adjusting for the length of their response. I'll go through that in a second. And then they provide also some additional markers for each wave about self-reported intellectual humility in a given domain, degree of accountability, and some other measures. So specifically about coding, this is where we look at acknowledging limits of their knowledge. I'm not an expert. Open-mindedness, considering alternative viewpoints. So like we say, well, on the one hand, I think this. On the other hand, my team members say this. Or confidence. For instance, this is the opposite, would be reversely loading. And indeed, it's like in the psychometric analysis, it wasn't reversely loading on a common factor. So if the person says, there is no doubt that this will happen. And so this was, by the way, contextualized. They see, because this is how participants perceived it in the study. This is also how we ask coders to screen through this. They would compare this to the prior rationale. So this rationale now, but then the prior rationale was this, and so on and so forth. So like, because this is also how participants actually saw it in the study. So they were contextualized. So additional measures, a whole range of tests for crystallized intelligence, fluid intelligence, a sense of competitiveness, pessimism about the world. This is so-called primal world beliefs measure. such as most things have a habit of getting worse in the world. Well, the world is a dangerous place. And honesty, humility, which is a dimension that's closely relevant from one of those classic personality measures, such as I'm an ordinary person who is no better than others. So it's like basically a sense of modesty. And so we did a very serious psychometric analysis for each of those to identify a robust core, which we then used for subsequent analyses. By the way, these metrics were um, well related to each other. So this is like a network graph of indicating the strength of the association. The thicker the line connecting, the more positive and stronger the association. But they are not very strong, as you can see, which means you can put them in the same analysis. Two measures I just want to highlight is this kind of domain-specific intellectual humility as a scale. So, for instance, for each domain, after each wave, we're asking about the how my views about X today may some that they turn out to be wrong, and so on. So 3 items per each, and a sense of accountability about the performance in a given wave. I felt responsible, I felt accountable, I felt answerable. Okay, so let's take a look at the results quickly. So as I said, first, some domains were more volatile than others. This is what they actually look like. This is the domains. On the top, you see very monotonous. This is CO2 emissions and infant mortality. On the bottom, you see that both the conflicts and poverty rates are more volatile. There's not necessarily a deterministic trend. If you want to quantify that, here's the quantification of the volatility. This is just presented the same data, somewhat different. Here's the actual data from participants. It's all over the place. So they make next year prediction, next 2 years predictions, 20-year out predictions, and you can see there's a huge variability. And some of them, they do better. As expected, monotonous, they are closer, especially at the beginning, than more volatile domains that further apart. And they actually don't get necessarily much better. In fact, in the volatile domains, they continue performing worse. This is now the second year. And what you want to keep in mind here is that there's a lot of variability, which is great because now we can take a look at this and try to see who is actually performing better. So we use the whole range of methods, both frequentist and Bayesian methods. And to really look at this kind of intellectual humility, we try to look at different degrees of analysis. So you can look at it both as some kind of general disposition that would be independent of the task at hand, or it may be a task forecasting specific tendency, or it may be even like domain specific deviation from the overall performance. And I want to see where exactly does this land? Where does it hit it just right so that it improves your accuracy? So here's a horse race, a result. On the x-axis, you see the error contribution. So the lowest score is better, right? Like the scores that are negative are better. To the left of this dashed vertical line. There's also this kind of band. If it's outside of this band, you would consider it meaningful. If it's within this band, it's kind of a toss, statistically speaking. And I sorted them overall, and as you can see, the results both from frequentist and Bayesian analysis are pretty similar. We also ran another horseshoe prior to regularized regression. The results for the top performers were comparable. So what do we see here? So in this horse race, and by the way, we included if people, for instance, participate in both tournaments in this model, as well as we included the year in which prediction was made as controls and various sort of and response bias. We also included that as control variables. So just don't show them because those are usual covariates here that we needed to control for. But the results look similar without them. In fact, even stronger. So what you see here is that the lowest error or the highest contributor to error reduction, if you want to speak in this causal language, is among those who had a higher accountability and particularly greater intellectual humility. On the other hand, those who felt they were very competitive, they actually were performed the worst. Now, remember, this was done in the first year and in the second year. For the third year, we don't have the prediction because it's 20-year out, so I can't really speak to that. But in the first and the second year, and of course, this is qualitatively different experience. You first make a prediction versus you provided feedback, how much you suck, and you can update your prediction. Okay, and so we can take a look. How much did people incorporate that? And did they actually start off well with this kind of, more accurate from the baseline? Or are they becoming more accurate? That is, do they calibrate better after they receive feedback? And this is what the results look like. It's really, really interesting. So, like I sorted in the same way, but you see the results for intellectual humility vary quite a bit if it's at the beginning versus post feedback. And it's particularly post feedback where intellectual humility comes to shine. By the way, not just as a coded intellectual humility, but also there's similar effect for task-specific intellectual humility, for accountability, other way around. It's if you start off with a greater sense of accountability that you actually will be more accurate. And also, fluid intelligence now suddenly emerges, even though the effect is a bit weaker, where after you receive feedback, those people who were smarter were better able to, were more accurate. And sense of competitiveness, similar to accountability, is more likely to be relevant at the beginning. By the way, also those who are more pessimist about the world in general, who are thinking the world goes to shite, those who were like that at the beginning, they were less accurate. So being pessimist actually not consistent with where the world is heading, maybe. Maybe we are overcorrecting there. What we also found there is that people who updated their beliefs, like I wanted to know what exactly is happening with this intellectual humility. What exactly do people do? Well, it turns out those who were more intellectually humble, they were more likely to update their predictions more often. And this updating their predictions more often was negatively related to accuracy, to inaccuracy. So the more they updated, the more accurate they were. The additional thing was that remember, we have this variability and uncertainty, both historical volatility, but also maybe in subjective uncertainty. And it turns out that it's particularly in those two domains in which it is more volatile where intellectual humility mattered most. By the way, those horizontal dashed lines is just like a baseline, a no change forecast. If like you basically assume the historical mean that it will be exactly the same as before, and in some cases you see people actually that one is very hard to beat, which is very depressing. As a matter of fact, even the best performers not doing as well as if you just say there will be no change. But nevertheless, this is neat and very similar result from subjective uncertainty. So remember, I asked people not only to make a prediction, the best case prediction, but also but also provide the lowest reasonable estimate and highest reasonable estimate. Why did I do it? Well, because people don't really understand probability. Lay people have no idea what percentage means. And percentage probability is very hard for them. So I wanted to get some kind of intuitive sense of uncertainty, subjective uncertainty. But now what I do with that, I take this highest and lowest reasonable estimate and I want to see if it in some ways qualifies the effect of intellectual humility on accuracy, okay? Is it when people are more uncertain, where they have a wide confidence interval, or where they have narrow confidence interval? Does it make sense? And indeed, it was similar to this historical volatility when they had a wide confidence interval that intellectual humility mattered most. So, like statistically, if you were to do some kind of so-called moderation analysis with simple slopes, it is when the uncertainty level was high, 75th percentile of uncertainty, you have this effect of intellectual humility, both for coded and self-reported, and not when it was low, when uncertainty was low. By the way, this kind of uncertainty ranges by themselves. Um, you can also use that information to take a look if people are better calibrated. That is, if the uncertainty range includes the accurate value still, that includes the ground truth, you better have the uncertainty ranges that are narrower rather than wider. Whereas if you have a wider uncertainty range and it includes the ground truth marker, then, well, you can just make them really wide. You will always be correct. It's just because you say everything is possible. But you want to be just right. You just calibrate it. So we can calculate that. So we looked at it as sort of in terms of this maze, where we didn't just take a maze of your error, but we combined the errors between the highest and the lowest, which essentially penalizes you for having very large uncertainty intervals. And try to take a look what predicts this calibrated ranges. And it turns out that indeed intellectual humility, along with fluid IQ, predicted it. By the way, we validated this. So we use sort of automated models with so-called BERT topic, which is a natural language processing technique. Just to give you a sample what the responses look like that we tried to validate. So here's one where somebody says, like, I was exactly correct in my predictions. Elon Musk bought Twitter using the same rationale as me. I may be in the 1% of other participants, but so is Elon Musk, and he's a genius, and so am I, and blah, blah, blah. Anyways, not very intellectually humble, as you can imagine. And this is true response. And then you have another person who may say, I've realized I got mixed up between my analysis. My numbers may be inflated. I needed to adjust them based on what my teammates' predictions helped me to realize my error and so on and so forth. So this person is much more likely to accept information from others and correct and talk about correcting their predictions. And so we took a look at sort of year two predictions because that's where intellectual humility seemed to matter most, right? Like, and where we expected this kind of calibrated action. And you probably don't want to look at those hyperparameters. This is just adjustments. What you want to see is like, are there particular classes of responses that would be associated with higher versus lower error? And the answer is yes, there are. And in some ways, they beautifully replicate results from both this study that I should present to you so far, as well as some prior research, recent research by Mark Himmelstein and others who say that, well, actually, those who are more accurate, they are much more likely to use base rates, for instance, base rate information. They are paying much more attention, both among the super forecasters and the general public, at how much change is there actually in this particular trend in the first place. They're also much more likely to be measured and consider uncertainty, which is what we describe as intellectual humility. They sometimes report on their confidence over their teammates, so like they view it relative to their teams. And what's very important is they report on their changes in predictions based on previous prediction performance, or provide sort of changes based on the rationales of other teammates. So those factors were associated with lower error. And that's obviously very neat. And those who had very global or mostly negative perspectives on changes, they were actually least likely to be accurate. So it turns out that intellectual humility, at least in this 3-year-long tournament, in the first 2 years at least, turned out to be the key. The strongest effects we saw from accountability and intellectual humility, especially contextualized level of intellectual humility. The effects were stronger than for IQ, education, or world beliefs. We also, by the way, found that's really neat, but it's exploratory, so I don't focus too much on it. A nice IQ intellectual humility interaction. So intellectual humility matters most among those people who already have the smarts, but it's kind of builds on top of it. It like acts essentially as a motivational layer on top of your intelligence, guides your intelligence towards accuracy by helping you to recalibrate instead of convincing yourself that you've been right all along. I think that's very cool. So, in summary, expert judgment seems to be limited and requires focus on accountability. I showed it to you with results from the ranges of studies that we did during and after the pandemic, trying to unpack how experts were navigating thinking about their causal models vis-a-vis ground truth about changes in the world. I also showed you that intellectual humility contributes to forecasting accuracy and better calibrated prediction ranges. And effects are in fact on par with cognitive abilities and sense of accountability, and they are particularly pronounced when uncertainty is high. Now, if any of this experimental stuff, data-driven results are not super exciting to you, I direct you to the more multimedia project that we have. We have the Futurescape project that outlines the visions of the future drawn by digital artists based on interviews with some of the best performers in this 3-year-long tournament. And if you're interested more in the predictions of experts, I direct you to the worldaftercovid.info, which is this award-winning digital media portal in which I gathered predictions at the beginning of the pandemic from world's leading scientists about what they think the future will hold at that time in 2021, and what we can do to make it a better place. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you, Igor. That was impressive. Not only obviously all of the research, but how you managed to pack all of that so tidily and comprehensively into your presentation. Because if I understood correctly, you were really presenting to us not one research project, but really a whole sequence of projects that you built up, starting from your initial observations on experts making comments in the news and the media, right? No, that was really interesting. I do have a few questions. Um, but I'd first like to open it up, as always, not just questions, but comments, thoughts, input from your own research and experience, things that you just want to share and discuss with Igor before we dive into some questions. As always, feel free to jump in at any point, so I'll go ahead briefly. Um, I'm really interested in the personalities of your respondents, and the intellectual humility part. The ones who, so I was interested already before you gave us that quote of the person who compared themselves to Elon Musk, and then after that, even more so. Have you any sense, and is there any way in another similar experiment to have a sense of their awareness of their intellectual humility or lack thereof? My totally non-expert sense is that somebody who's more intellectually humble might have a greater metacognition about that because they're actively trying to cultivate and present those qualities. And the person who exhibits less intellectual humility might not be aware of that absence. But that's something I wanted to ask you about from your knowledge, maybe not from this experiment per se, but from your work in psychology overall. And lastly, I'm not sure if this is something that came up already in the graphs. What percentage of the respondents did you find relatively low in intellectual humility?
Yeah, so no, this is great. The first thing is, I mean, I talked about this last week in my talk on wisdom and how to, specifically the idea is how do you measure the characteristics of such the metacognitive characteristics like intellectual humility and it's inherently challenging. Like I describe it as a so-called humility paradox, which is very funny. Not just because, you know, when somebody says I'm very humble, I'm the most humble person in the world, of course you will not believe this person because that's literally the opposite of intellectual humility. Uh, but uh, uh, but the issue that you bring up is actually closer to why I think it's interesting. The one where the person says, I'm the most humble person in the world, that's essentially a sign of social desirability. I mean, the person is just communicating the thing that they expect others to be attractive, right? And so, especially in the context in which they evaluate it, they may just do that because they feel incentivized to do so. But what you bring up is another issue, namely, if you are low in metacognitive sensitivity, if you are really low in intellectual humility or perspective taking ability, right, you're really not open to revising your beliefs. That means you're also, by definition, not open to revising your beliefs about yourself. So if I'm really low in intellectual humility and Mira tells me, Igor, you kind of suck, you really don't listen to others, and you're not good at perspective taking, well, by definition, I will not be accepting that. I mean, I may just listen and dismiss that. And so that means that I will be heavily off in my self-assessment. Maybe I will be right. Maybe I will actually have maybe I have like really deep insecurity about my intellectual humility and so on. And so I will say that yeah, no, actually very low. But most of the time I'll probably be saying, no, I'm just average or I'm better than average because most people think that they're better than average. And so as a consequence of that, you are miscalibrated in your self-assessment precisely because you are unable to accept and incorporate feedback from others. And therefore, you cannot really calibrate yourself in your self views about your performance. You basically remain blind, unfortunately, to others. Now, I don't know what to do about that, but that, of course, leads to very different educational approach where you
Mm.
have to be much more direct and instructive with these individuals than for those with those who are potentially more intellectually humble. Your second part about like what is the percentage? I mean, this is very hard for me to assess because I usually assess intellectual humility in relative terms rather than in absolute terms. If you ask me more concretely, how often do people acknowledge that they need more information? Um, well, not very often. I'll sort of this way. So it's rather an exception than the rule. I would
Okay.
actually say that specifically that aspect of fallibility in the coding and open-ended responses was very rare.
I see.
Acknowledging others' viewpoints is a bit more frequent. But yeah, just like spontaneously saying, oh, yeah, actually, maybe my prediction sucks and I really don't do well. This is not happening very often. And, we can say whatever we want about that. Maybe it's about our culture that doesn't incentivize that. Maybe it is about something else.
So does that, if I'm understanding correctly, does that mean that um, the ability to recognize other people's knowledge and opinions was not the same as intellectual humility? So if I'm understanding correctly, intellectual humility was a little bit more on the a priori, not assuming that you're likely to be right. Whereas someone might be not very intellectually humble, might assume they tend to be right, but may then later be able to recognize other people's opinions. It connects a little bit to a follow-up question I had from your first answer, which was whether somebody can be intellectually humble in terms of their awareness of their ability to be wrong in such an exercise or in general, but not be what you would in everyday life describe as a humble person. So can
Yeah,
those two traits
right.
be
Yeah.
detached in
Yeah.
your respondents?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so first, like, what is what's a classic definition of intellectual humility? I mean, like the way how my students and I define it in our sort of like standard, like we published a Nature review piece on this. That is kind of the canonical piece on what is intellectual humility right now. And the way how I define it in Porter et al. Is essentially recognition of limits of your knowledge and your fallibility.
Mhm.
That's at the core of it. Now, sometimes you say, well, that involves you being sensitive to others' perspectives and willing to listen to others. So, yeah, sure. But that doesn't mean that you will always just be persuaded by others, because
Mhm.
ultimately the core is really about this metacognitive awareness about your beliefs and being willing to recognize that you may be wrong. So that's what like it's a intellectual or epistemic humility is about your knowledge, right? About your belief system. It's not necessarily about being nice or modest. And that leads to a second question. I remember in the study, for instance, that's precisely why we included measures of honesty, humility, which is the dimension of one of the most common personality questionnaires that targets this other form of modesty slash humility, or it's called
Mhm.
honesty humility subscale, where you just look at if people are nice, if they are bragging, and so on and so forth. Like, of course, self-assessment. And so that's not that, right? Like, you can be um, very much full of yourself and yet doubt your limitations. Or
Mhm.
you can be a very modest person who is firmly convinced that modest in a social sense, firmly convinced of their perspective and would not
Mhm.
change their perspective. Right? Like I'm
Mhm.
thinking of somebody who's, you know, a good, deeply religious Christian who is who learned in the church to be modest, but at the same time is very much a zealot. Right, like actually misunderstands what all that teaching, Christian teaching, was about, and confuses just presenting yourself in this shy and timid and modest fashion rather than being open-minded and consider different viewpoints.
Very interesting. Thank you. I do have another question, but I'm going to pause for a moment in case I'm monopolizing.
Hi, I'm sorry.
Yes, Anna, hi.
I'm
Please.
sorry. I'm having issues with my connection, internet connection, so I cannot raise. There is usually for raising the
Yes,
hand.
no problem. Go right ahead.
Okay, and also I apologize if maybe Igor you tackled this question before. Maybe I miss it because of the connectivity. But then so I got a bit that you were talking about different, let's say, disciplines. And you were talking about lawyers, but also you were talking about health. And of course, you put the example of COVID-19, what happened during COVID. And then during COVID was also, let's say, the scientifics, they were called to predict, but of course it was uncertainty. But then within the regulations, they have to provide advice. But of course, because it was new COVID, so nobody knew how to handle this situation. The director general of WHO, he had a committee of scientifics, and they were like providing, let's say, guidance. And then at the beginning, they were also because of uncertainty, they were providing guidance. Then afterwards, they realized that it was not true, it was incorrect, but then how to deal with this situation. So I wonder if I understand that now you say humility and modesty, but then in this kind of situation that is, let's say, states were asking for guidance and they have to provide the guidance. And of course, there were certain populations, a lot of people, they were scared. So you have to provide a guidance, but you have to also, let's say, portray uncertainty, although that you don't have it, but because of, let's say, the emotions of the population that they were scared and dealing with this situation, but also like countries. I remember that Donald Trump was his first period. So he was also trying to provide answers, and actually he was also dealing like how to use bleaching products to deal with this. And then you have Dr. Fauci at that time that was the lead of science, and he was making faces like, please don't use detergent or bleaching products. So I wonder, and I'm again sorry if you already tackled that, but I miss it. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, so the political implications of this, Anna, is really, really interesting. I mean, I'm totally sympathetic to the intricacies of, it's one thing to focus on sort of like, what do you believe and how do you sort of like handle knowledge, which is what I'm focusing on, right? And like, how do you handle the causal models and the predictions? What is the confidence that you may have about those? Another thing is how do you communicate them to the public, and what does it take to, at the same time, convince the public to take on some policies that at a given moment you believe to be the most up to date. And then finally, of course, is the issue of like, what do you do when you believe that the scientific base has changed about something? Like in the case of the pandemic, it was very beautifully and it's very unfortunate that, I mean, from the scientific perspective, it was beautiful. From the public policy perspective, it's a nightmare when at the beginning, Fauci and others communicated that we need to wash our hands excessively and wipe out all the surfaces because we thought COVID is transmitted through touch and through physical contact. And then we realized, well, actually, it's an airborne virus, which is a completely different thing, and we need to wear masks. And the reason why the beginning masks were not on the table is because literally we didn't have many masks. I mean, just to give an example, in Toronto, after the prior epidemic that we had, where Toronto was hit incredibly hard, there was this whole focus group discussion about what to do to prepare yourself better in the future, because we handled the prior pandemic, all those flus so badly relative to some other places. And people said, okay, we need to have a stock of masks. They should be available. They should be deployable to the population if something like this happens again. And guess what happened? Half a year before the pandemic, I don't kid you, half a year before the pandemic, they just tossed all those masks because apparently they expired. I mean, they probably did expire, but the point is that knowledge, a decade passed and people just tossed it out of the window and forgot about it. And they didn't even think about that. So this may be important in the future. And that, of course, created a shortage. And that's exactly why we had some policy members and policy officials then at the beginning talk about that you don't need those masks because we didn't have enough masks for the people who needed them most. But of course, that sort of includes the rational calculus. The problem there is not communicating that because it seems so complex and so uncertain, and communicates that you need to that your scientific base is subject to revision, which is exactly what science is about. Was exactly the problem for Fauci and others. I bet many more people in the United States would not have thought Fauci is the, like the person to blame for everything. I mean, I even in Canada, I lived in a house where somebody had this book by Kennedy on their shelf, talking how Fauci is like the worst thing that could have the devil, essentially. And unfortunately, that the reason why that I think happened is in part because uh, the public, I mean, this is just my perception, the public was sensitive how politicians tried to manage and mask the uncertainty, and then it backfired. Mask the uncertainty and at the same time regulate the public. And the counterexample to the United States, by the way, is Denmark, where the early on the policy officials were, my understanding, but also based on some scientific evidence on this front, were much more upfront about the uncertainty around the policy recommendations. And that it was this uncertainty around the policy recommendations that, well, maybe there's something in the Danish DNA, the public DNA, where they were more willing to accept that uncertainty. That may, of course, play a role as well. Maybe the populace in general is a bit more educated and about science and how science works. That could also play a role. But they were more receptive and they actually trusted their politicians more than what this picture is that I showed for the United States, where you would rather pick a random person from the street to make a recommendation about various pandemic-related societal social issues rather than a politician. So, I think like we have to separate, so to say, between this kind of like how you communicate with the public from how we handle knowledge and be recognizing that there is an uncertainty. But we should have a conversation about uh, why do we need to micromanage the public? Can we talk to the public like they're grown-ups and give them the knowledge base instead of forcing them? Like in some ways, it felt fairly forced to do things one way or another, right? And that led then to reactance, what psychologists call the reactance movement, including all this do your own research stuff. But of course, that preceded the pandemic. These are complex issues, and I think this is not just about intellectual humility. It's about science communication. It's about how we handle knowledge and our beliefs in a period of misinformation, and it's also about how do we, on the one hand, have this information and recommendations that we want the majority of the people to take, and at the same time do things that are accommodating different perspectives in the society and individual rights of individuals. So that's tricky. But yeah, I really appreciate the question.
Thank you for your.
Go ahead, Anna. No, sorry, Anna. Please go ahead.
No, it just I appreciate the answer, Igor. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was a great answer. I wanted to hop in on what Anna raised because you together pulled out a lot of different aspects of the presentation. It is something that I've been wondering about earlier. It seemed to me like there were a few different phenomena. There was your slide of the sample of about 200 or so people who were talking about whom they would like to have at the dinner table. And there, as you mentioned, quotation was really low, but if I recall correctly, medical professionals and scientists were relatively highly trusted. That is obviously a sample of 200, but it contrasts with the discussion you and Anna were having just now about the general distrust towards scientific authorities in the pandemic. If I recall correctly, I think the slide was from a similar time period. And I had a connected question earlier when you were talking about the failure of certain predictions and the consequences for public trust. And there was obviously this nice thread from the financial crisis, but I wondered whether the public is aware, though, of the fallibility of the predictions. So you had these findings that were saying the scientists were not necessarily predicting it originally more accurately than the layperson. And that led to this connection that the public might trust them less. But the public is not aware of those findings. And they are aware, for example, in the financial crisis, of an entire sector of professionals having had a certain faith in a certain sector and in a certain future, and they saw the failure of that belief before their eyes. Whereas I wasn't able to see sort of a tidy mapping from that public awareness of a failure of prediction to the failure in the health sector. I've just seen your message that you have a meeting. So there is also right now at 5, which means you could also very much put a pin in my question and we can chat about that as part of your visiting fellowship here at KGT, rather than forcing you into a rushed answer.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, maybe we should talk about there because you ask a lot of different things
Yeah.
here. I'm not even sure what your main question is, Mira, because
Um,
I can explain to you that it's not that particular study was not about whom you want to have at the dinner table. Those are multiple questions, including whom would you expect to make more accurate prediction about mental health and social welfare during the pandemic. That's number one. And number two, whom would you want to advise and provide recommendations on policy related to that, right? Like, so it's not about sort of like whom do you want to have a beer with.
yes.
And I
No.
think a public understanding of scientists and other professionals is fairly refined and context specific. Um, I think all things being equal, that sample, which did not include conspiracy theorists, obviously they probably did not spend much time on these crowd working platforms where I collected the data. Um, they would probably think, well, yeah, I mean, if it's asking about mental health or health related stuff or about social phenomena, then probably epidemiologists who know a little bit about the diseases and psychologists and social workers would be the one to talk to. Yes, that's sort of like the that I've expected, and that's exactly what we found. Um, Whether they trust them more in other domains, I'm not sure. But that's the first
Okay.
question. Then you had some other things. Maybe we'll talk about
We
that
can
as
talk
well.
about those. So a bit of self-selection out of the people who, for example, Anna was referring to, who didn't trust medical professionals. Potentially in her sample, they were self-selecting out of
No,
answering
I
who
don't
they
think they were
trust.
self-selecting. I think those people are not part of the platforms in the first place. I mean, they're
In
also
that
very
sense.
few. Yeah, they're very few, right? Like, so I mean, we're focusing on those edge cases with the conspiracy theories and so on and so forth, anti-vaxxers, whatever. And there's actually a smaller population, but also like they are not easy to get access to because they're by definition mistrust. So you will not
Indeed.
get them to fill out surveys for public universities.
Mhm.
there's also that. Yeah, so there's a bit of a bias, but I think like the percentage is much smaller than we think because those cases were much more in the news than maybe they should have been. But that's a separate conversation.
Indeed. Thank you. Anyone who wants to join us for any of these conversations over lunch at Skifanoia, do join us. Thank you, Igor. This was so nice and so rich.